The great bonfire of the blood moon ceremony had been burning since sundown. It rose in crackling orange columns above the stone courtyard of Ashenvale Keep, painting the faces of 200 assembled wolves in shifting shades of gold and shadow. Lords and warriors, healers and highborn ladies, they had all gathered beneath the swollen red moon for one purpose: to witness King Cedric Dunmore take his chosen Luna, the woman his wolf had selected, the woman who would stand beside the most powerful alpha in the 5 northern territories and bear the heirs of the Dunmore bloodline. Marin Voss stood at the edge of the ceremonial circle, close enough to the fire to feel the heat on her face. She was 22 years old. Her dark hair had been braided and threaded with small white winter flowers by her grandmother that very morning, and her ceremonial gown of deep forest green had been altered 3 times by the seamstresses of House Voss to fit her perfectly. She had been preparing for this moment for nearly a year. Everyone knew she was the chosen one. The letters exchanged between King Cedric and her father, Lord Edric Voss, had made the arrangement plain. The ceremony had been announced to the entire kingdom 2 moon cycles ago. She was supposed to walk into that circle tonight and come out a queen. She pressed her palms flat against her thighs to stop them from trembling, not from fear. She had told herself it wasn't fear, it was anticipation. He chose you, she reminded herself. He chose you. But even as she thought it, her eyes found him across the firelit circle, and the thought dissolved like morning frost. King Cedric Dunmore stood at the center of the ceremonial ground. He was tall and broad-shouldered, built like a man who had been carved from the same black stone as the mountains surrounding Ashenvale. His dark gold hair was swept back from a face of sharp, hard angles, a jaw like a blade, eyes the color of pale winter ice. He wore the ceremonial black armor of the Dunmore line, and the obsidian crown of the Alpha Kings rested on his head, with the casual authority of something that had always belonged there. He was, by any measure, the most powerful man Marin had ever stood in a room with. He was also not looking at her. His ice-pale gaze was drifting across the assembled crowd, pausing briefly on the face of each highborn woman present before moving on. There was no warmth in that gaze, no longing. He looked like a man completing an administrative task rather than one about to claim his destined mate. Marin's grandmother, old Edda, leaned close to her ear. "Stop searching his face, child. A king doesn't wear his heart on display in front of his court." Marin nodded, pulling her eyes away. She smoothed her gown for the 4th time. The high priest, a gaunt elderly man named Father Reyes, raised his carved bone staff above the fire. The assembled crowd fell silent with remarkable speed. Even the wind seemed to quiet itself. "The blood moon rises," Father Reyes intoned, his thin voice carrying farther than seemed physically possible. "The old law of the Alpha calls. Let the king step forward and speak the name of the one his wolf has chosen. Let the bond be witnessed. Let it be sealed." Cedric stepped forward. The firelight caught the planes of his face and made him look ancient, like a figure stepped out of the old stories. The entire assembly leaned in, collective breath held. Marin's heart kicked against her ribs. He opened his mouth. "I name Silvara Voss." The silence that followed was not an ordinary silence. It was the silence of 200 people processing something that did not make immediate sense. Then the whispers began. Marin heard her own name somewhere in them. "Marin, not Marin," he said Silvara. But the sounds were coming from very far away, as though someone had pressed wool tightly over both her ears. She stood perfectly still, her white-flowered braids perfectly arranged, her forest green gown perfectly fitted, while the world rearranged itself into a shape she did not recognize. Silvara Voss. Her mother, 44 years old, widow of Lord Edric Voss, who had died the previous winter, beautiful in the way of certain older women, sharply elegant, carefully composed, with the same dark hair as Marin's but threaded with distinguished silver at the temples. Silvara Voss, who had accompanied her daughter to Ashenvale Keep for the Blood Moon ceremony as a chaperone and a proud mother. Silvara Voss stepped out of the crowd. She did not look triumphant. She did not look apologetic. She looked composed, the way she always looked, her chin at that precise angle that had always made Manor feel, as a child, that she was being evaluated and found acceptable but not exceptional. She crossed the ceremonial ground with measured, graceful steps, and she stopped beside the Alpha King. Kedrick looked down at her. Something shifted in his ice-pale eyes, something human for just a moment. Father Reyes raised his staff again. Let the bond be witnessed. Wait. The word came from Manor. She hadn't planned it. It simply came out, flat and clear, cutting across the priest's ceremonial drone like a stone thrown through glass. Every head turned toward her. She felt the weight of 200 pairs of eyes like a physical pressure. She stood at the edge of the fire circle, her hands no longer trembling, because they had gone entirely numb. Kedrick's ice-pale gaze found her for what might have been the first time that evening. He looked at her with an expression she could not immediately name. It wasn't cruelty. It wasn't pleasure. It was something much worse. It was the look of a man who had already moved past a decision he considered settled. Lady Manor, he said, his deep voice carrying the practiced evenness of someone who had spent years making difficult announcements. Your family will be honored and compensated. House Voss remains of valued. I am not asking about compensation. Her voice surprised her with its steadiness. She had never spoken to a king this way before. She had never spoken to anyone this way before. She was, by nature, a quiet person, careful, considered. But something had split open inside her chest, and the words were coming through the gap. I am asking you to look at me, Manor said, her voice dropping just low enough that only the nearest people could hear the fracture in it. Really look at me. I have been preparing to stand in this circle for 11 months. My father spent the last of his health negotiating the arrangements with your council. My grandmother sewed flowers into my hair this morning. She paused, her jaw tightened. Did your wolf choose my mother, my king? Or did a man make a choice and decide to call it fate? The question landed in the silence like a burning coal. Kedrick's jaw tightened. Something moved behind his eyes, not guilt, not quite, but the faintest echo of it. He did not answer. Silvara turned to look at her daughter. Her expression was, as always, impossible to read. Manor. Don't, Manor said softly. She stepped back from the edge of the fire circle. Then she stepped back again. The crowd parted for her with uncomfortable, collective speed, as though they were all suddenly aware that standing too close to a woman in the process of being publicly unmade was its own form of bad luck. Manor walked back through the parted crowd. Her posture was straight. Her steps were measured. Not one person tried to stop her. She passed her grandmother, old Etta, and saw the ancient woman's eyes bright with unshed tears and a fierce, helpless grief that was somehow worse than any of the whispers. She did not cry until she reached the outer corridor of the keep, well out of sight of the fire and the ceremony and the king who had spoken her mother's name. Then she pressed her back against the cold stone wall, tipped her head up toward the dark ceiling, and let the tears come in silence. She pressed one hand to her flat stomach without fully understanding why. She had exactly one secret in the world. And tonight, for the first time, she understood how dangerous it was. She thought back to the night at Graymere, the diplomatic summit 3 months prior, where she had gone in her ailing father's place, carrying his letters of intent and his careful political instructions, and the weight of House Voss's future on her 22-year-old shoulders. She had handled it well. She had always handled things well. That was the particular loneliness of being competent. No one thought to ask whether the weight was manageable because the weight was always being managed. Kedrick had found her on the outer battlements an hour before the final dinner, when she had slipped away from the heat and the noise of the hall to stand in the cold and feel the wind come down from the mountain peaks. He had come out for the same reason. She suspected. He had stood beside her, looking at the same mountains, and for a while neither of them had said anything at all. Then he had said, without looking at her, "Do you ever feel like the thing everyone wants you to be and the thing you actually are moving further and further apart?" And she had said, "Every single day." And that had been the beginning of 4 of the most honest hours she had spent with another person in her adult life. They had talked about everything and nothing. His father, hers. The burden of names you were born into. The way duty and desire worked against each other in small, persistent ways. He had told her about the wolf, how it sometimes knew things before the man did, how it was unnerving to have a part of yourself that was its own separate authority. She had told him about the estate books, how she had learned to manage the accounts after her father's health declined, how she had discovered that she was very good at it, and that there was a particular satisfaction in being good at something practical. He had laughed genuinely, suddenly, when she described dealing with a tenant dispute over a shared drainage ditch, because the detail of it was so specific and so unheroic, and so completely at odds with the polished setting they were standing in. She had never forgotten the sound of that laugh. It had been one unguarded night, long after the dinner was over and the fire in the borrowed room had burned down to warm coals. She had known it was complicated. She had told herself, on the road home, that complicated things could be managed with careful thinking and time. She had been wrong about the time. Standing in the dark corridor of Ashenvale Keep, listening to the distant music of her mother's betrothal feast, Manor pressed her hand flat against her stomach and made a decision with the same practical finality she brought to the estate accounts. She would leave tonight. She would go home. She would figure the rest out from solid ground, because the ground here had proven entirely unreliable. 3 days after the blood moon ceremony, Ashenvale Keep was still buzzing. The gossip had taken on a life of its own, growing and telling the way all court gossip does, fed by idle hands and winter boredom. By the second morning, Manor had heard no fewer than 11 different versions of the previous night's events. In some versions, she had screamed at the king. In others, she had fainted. In one particularly dramatic retelling that had reached even the kitchen maids, she had reportedly attempted to throw herself into the ceremonial fire. None of them were true. The truth was quieter and therefore less satisfying to those who wanted spectacle. The truth was that Manor Voss had simply gone to her chambers, washed her face, and begun packing. She was nearly finished when her mother's knock came at the door. It was the knock she recognized, 3 precise raps, evenly spaced, the knock of a woman who considered knocking a formality rather than a genuine request for permission. "Come in," Manor said. Without turning from the leather travel chest she was folding her woolen riding clothes into. Silvara entered. She wore a new gown, Manor noticed. Deep blue silk with silver trim, not the gown of a chaperone accompanying a daughter to a ceremony. The gown of a woman who expected to be looked at. She had already begun then. Quietly and efficiently settling into her new position the way she settled into everything, without visible effort. "You are leaving," Silvara said. It wasn't a question. "I am going home, to Thornfield." "Thornfield is half a kingdom away. The mountain passes are dangerous in winter." "I am aware." Silvara stood in the center of the room, her hands clasped in front of her, watching Manor pack with an unreadable expression. The silence stretched between them, taut and uncomfortable. "I didn't ask for this," Silvara said finally. Manor stopped folding. She kept her back to her mother. "He came to me 3 weeks ago," Silvara continued, her voice taking on the careful cadence of a woman choosing every word deliberately. "He told me what his wolf was telling him. I told him it was wrong, that you were the arranged candidate, that the letters had been sent, that the preparations were made. He said the wolf does not recognize arrangements." "And you told me nothing," Manor said quietly. "For 3 weeks you said nothing." Another silence. "What would you have had me say?" Manor turned around. She looked at her mother, really looked at her, the way she had always struggled to do, because looking directly at Silvara Voss had always felt like looking at a mirror that showed you a version of yourself that was better in every measurable way. Taller, sharper, more composed. "You could have warned me," Manor said, her voice very quiet. "You could have let me leave before the ceremony so I didn't have to stand in that circle in this dress in front of 200 people, waiting for my name to be called. You could have saved me that." Silvara's composed expression shifted just slightly, just for a moment, something brief and painful crossing her features before discipline snapped it shut again. "You are right," she said. "That I regret." It was the most honest thing Manor could remember her mother saying in years. It didn't make anything better, but it landed differently than she had expected. "What happens to the arrangement with Father's house?" Manor asked, turning back to her packing. "The alliance he negotiated." "The King's Council will honor the alliance regardless. House Voss will not lose its standing." "How generous." "Manor, I am going home, Mother." Manor closed the leather chest with a firm, final snap. "I wish you well. I genuinely do, but I cannot stay in this keep and watch what comes next. That is beyond what I am capable of." Silvara looked at her for a long moment. Then her gaze dropped slowly, deliberate, to Marin's midsection. It was the briefest glance, a fraction of a second, but Manor felt it like a hand on her throat. She forced herself not to move, not to cover herself with her arms, not to react at all. "Be careful in the mountain passes," Silvara said at last. She crossed to the door. "The eastern route is safer this time of year, less ice." She left without looking back. Manor stood still in the center of her chamber, for a long time after the door closed. Then she pressed both hands over her stomach, and the secret she had been carrying for 8 weeks settled over her like a weight she was only beginning to understand the true cost of. She was pregnant. The father was King Kedrick Dunmore. 3 months before the Blood Moon ceremony, during the summit at Graymere, a diplomatic gathering of the northern territories where she had attended as her ailing father's representative, Kedrick had found her on the windswept outer battlements, alone and cold and irritated by the politics inside. They had spoken for 4 hours, the only 2 people on the battlements, wrapped in borrowed furs, watching the storm come in over the mountains. He had been different outside the court, less armored in every sense. He had laughed twice, genuinely. It had been one night, one unguarded night at the end of a long summit, with the mountain wind howling outside and the world narrowed down to a single room, and 2 people who had, for a few hours, forgotten what they owed to other people's expectations. He had said nothing specific, made no specific promise. She had told herself she expected nothing. Then she had come home, and the weeks had passed, and the truth had made itself undeniable. She had said nothing because she didn't want the child to be a political instrument. She had said nothing because she was afraid. She had said nothing because some part of her had believed, foolishly. She now understood that the Blood Moon ceremony would resolve everything, that the king's wolf would call her name, and the impossible situation would untangle itself. Instead, he had called her mother's name. Manor lifted her travel chest, hoisted it onto her shoulder with more ease than any of the court ladies would have thought proper, and walked out of her chamber. She did not look back. She had one night to get through the eastern mountain pass before the storm closed it, and she had no intention of wasting it on grief. Not yet grief was a luxury, survival first. She had learned that from her mother. She supposed she had to be grateful for something. Thornfield was not a grand estate. It sat in the shallow valley below the Gray Spine mountain range, surrounded by dark pine forests and a river that ran cold and fast and never fully froze even in the deepest winter. The main house was old stone, low-ceilinged in most rooms, with thick walls and small windows designed to hold heat rather than invite light. It was practical, honest, nothing about it was built to impress. Manor had always loved it with a fierceness that she'd never been able to fully explain to people who hadn't grown up in it. She arrived on the fourth night of her journey, exhausted and saddle-sore, with thin ice on her cloak and a feeling in her chest like the beginning of something large and inevitable. Old Edda was waiting at the gate with a lantern and a cup of broth, as though she had known precisely when to expect her. "Come inside," Edda said simply, taking the reins of Marin's horse. "How did you?" "I left the morning after you, child. I'm old, not slow." They sat at the kitchen fire for an hour, not speaking much, the way women who genuinely know each other can sit in comfortable quiet without filling it unnecessarily. Edda asked no questions about the ceremony. She asked no questions about Silvara. She fed Marin broth and bread and watched her granddaughter's face with her sharp old eyes, and eventually she said, with the matter-of-fact gentleness of a woman who had lived long enough to have said hard things many times, "How far along?" Marin stared at the fire. 8 weeks, perhaps 9 now. Edda nodded slowly, as though this was difficult news she had already prepared herself to receive. "Does he know?" "No." "Does your mother?" "She suspects. She didn't ask directly." "That is its own kind of answer." They sat with that for a moment. "I am not going back," Marin said. Her voice was steady. She had made the decision cleanly, without drama, somewhere on the mountain road in the dark. It was the kind of decision that, once made, settled into bone and didn't rattle. "I am going to stay here, have this child quietly, and build a life that is mine. Not arranged, not negotiated, not contingent on what any king's wolf decides." Edda looked at her for a long time, and when the child is born with ice-pale eyes. Marin pressed her lips together. "We will manage that when it comes." The months that followed were the quietest of Marin's life. She learned to manage the estate with the pragmatic competence of someone who has been forced into capability. She handled the tenant agreements and the winter stores. She trained the 2 young hounds that had been her father's last gift to the household. She mended the east wall of the barn herself, in the cold, with her hands going red and stiff, because the work made her tired enough to sleep without dreaming. She did not follow the news from Ashenvale. She tried not to. But news traveled in winter the same way cold did through every gap, no matter how carefully you sealed things. And so the news came in pieces, delivered by trading carts and passing merchants, and one particularly talkative herbalist who stopped for shelter during a late-season storm. The news was this: King Cedric Dunmore had not completed the Luna bonding. The ceremony had been started. Her mother had stepped into the circle. Father Reyes had raised his staff. But the final sealing, the ancient blood rite that bound an Alpha King to his Luna permanently, had been interrupted when Cedric's wolf had done something that no wolf in living memory had done in the middle of a bonding ceremony. It had refused. Not loudly, not violently. The king had simply gone still, standing in the fire circle with Silvara's hand in his, and his eyes had changed, the ice-pale color shifting to the deep, disoriented gold of a wolf fighting its own instincts. And he had stood there for a long, terrible minute while the entire assembly watched, before Father Reyes had quietly stepped forward and suggested they reconvene for the final rite at the next moon. The next moon had come and gone, and the one after that. The bonding had not been completed. Silvara Voss was installed in the Queen's Tower at Ashenvale, addressed as Luna Designate, attended by servants and dressed in the colors of the Dunmore line. She appeared at all formal functions beside the king. The court had begun to simply accept her presence as settled fact. But the blood rite had not been done. And without the blood rite, no Luna was truly bound. Marin absorbed this information with the outward calm of someone who had trained herself over long months to feel things privately. She thanked the herbalist for the news, gave him a hot meal and a dry corner to sleep in, and went to bed. In the dark, alone, she pressed her hand to the hard, rounded curve of her stomach and felt the child move, a small, decisive role that was becoming more assertive every week. And she allowed herself, just for a moment, to feel the thing she spent most of her waking hours refusing to feel. Hope was a dangerous thing, she had learned that. But the child moved again, impatient and certain, and the feeling persisted despite her best efforts. Marin's son was born on the last night of the winter storms, when the wind was howling so hard the candles in the bedchamber kept guttering, and Etta had to hold the flame cover steady with one hand while managing everything else with the other. He arrived without ceremony and without complications, which Marin took as a sign that the universe was perhaps extending some small courtesy after the several it had recently withdrawn. He was, from the very first moment, absolutely unmistakable. She had hoped stupidly, she knew it was stupid, that the child might look more like her, that the dark hair and the angular features of the Voss line might assert themselves, that she might be able to look at her son without immediately seeing who else was in his face. But no. He was done more from the moment he opened his eyes. The eyes were the pale winter ice of his father's line, sharp and alert even in his first hour of life, tracking the light of the candles with an unnerving focus that made Etta go very quiet for a moment before she collected herself and began counting his fingers. His hair, what little there was of it, was dark gold. He was bigger than Marin had expected, long and solidly built, even as a newborn, with the broad frame that marked the alpha bloodline even before it had any substance to fill it. Marin held him and looked at his face for a long time. "What will you name him?" Etta asked softly. She had been thinking about this for months. She had made lists, crossed them out, made new ones. "Rays," she said, "after the old priest. He was the one kind face in that courtyard." Etta made a sound of quiet approval. She tucked the blankets more firmly around them both and moved to stoke the fire. "He has his father's eyes." "I know. You cannot hide that forever." "I know. Marin's." "I know, grandmother." Her voice was soft but final. "I know it cannot be hidden forever, but he is 3 hours old. Give me tonight." Etta said nothing more. She settled into her chair by the fire, folded her hands in her lap, and kept watch while the storm outside gradually, eventually, began to quiet. Marin looked down at Rays, her son, her secret, the one thing in the world that was entirely and undeniably hers in a way that nothing had ever been before, and she made him a promise that she kept entirely to herself, because some promises are too fierce to say out loud. "I will not let you become a piece in anyone's game. Not a crown's, not a wolf's, not a king's. You are mine first. You are yours always." The wind dropped. The candles steadied. The child slept. A year passed, then 2. In Thornfield, life built itself slowly and with surprising stubbornness, the way moss grows on stone, unpromising at first, then suddenly everywhere. Rays walked at 10 months, which alarmed the midwife and delighted Etta. He said his first word at 11 months, which was wolf, which alarmed everyone and delighted no one. By 18 months he was climbing the fence posts of the paddock with the casual ease of a much older child, and by 2 years old he was growling in his sleep in a way that made the household dogs go flat on the floor with their ears pressed down. The alpha blood was strong in him, stronger than Marin had anticipated, stronger, she suspected, than it had any business being in a child that young. She watched him carefully. She loved him ferociously. She kept him close and kept the estate gates latched and told herself the cold clench in her chest every time a stranger's horse appeared on the road below the valley was just caution. Reasonable, practical caution. It was not, she admitted privately, entirely reasonable or practical. It was fear. And the news from Ashenvale did not make it easier. The news came in a different shape now, less gossip, more gravity. The merchants and travelers who passed through Thornfield's valley spoke of it with lowered voices, the way people speak of things that are frightening and not fully understood. The king had grown strange, they said. Not cruel, he had never been kind in the way of poets' kings, but he had always been just. Now he was unpredictable. He would sit through entire council sessions in silence, contributing nothing, his eyes unfocused and distant, and then suddenly emerge from the stillness with a ferocity that sent his senior advisors stumbling backward from the table. His wolf was restless, people said, unsettled, fighting something it couldn't name. The Luna designate, Silvara Voss, still not fully bonded, still living in the Queen's Tower, had reportedly attempted twice more to complete the blood rite, and both times the king's wolf had refused at the final moment. Not violently. The wolf simply went still, and the pale gold light in Kedrick's eyes deepened until it swallowed the ceremony whole, and the priest had quietly suggested they wait. The court was fracturing along familiar lines. Half of the council believed the king was cursed. The other half believed the Luna designate was somehow the wrong choice, and that the wolf knew it. A small, increasingly vocal third faction, newer voices, younger lords, was beginning to suggest that the king's refusal might be connected to the disappeared daughter of House Voss, the one who had walked away from the fire circle on the night of the blood moon ceremony. Marin heard about this faction on a cold morning in early spring, when a cloth merchant stopped to trade at Thornfield's gate. He mentioned it with the casual authority of someone relaying unremarkable news. She thanked him, paid him fairly, and went back inside. She stood at the kitchen window and watched Rays in the courtyard below, 2 years old and already too fast, chasing the household cat with the focused determination of a small predator who had not yet learned to be embarrassed by his instincts. They are starting to look, she thought. It's only a matter of time. She turned away from the window and began, quietly and systematically, making plans. At Ashenvale, behind the thick stone walls and the fluttering black and silver banners, King Kedrick Dunmore was indeed losing a war with himself. It had started the night of the blood moon ceremony, when he had stood in the fire circle with Silvara Voss's hand in his, and felt his wolf go silent for the first time in his adult life. Not peaceful. Silent the way a wound goes silent after the initial shock, a hollow, startled quiet that precedes a much larger pain. He had told himself during the weeks that followed that the wolf was adjusting, that the unusual nature of the match, an older woman, an unconventional choice, was causing friction that would resolve with time. His advisors had said the same. Father Rays had cited old cases, historical anomalies, documented instances of the bond taking longer to settle. But the weeks became months, and the silence in his wolf did not fill with acceptance. It filled with something else, a dull, grinding ache that he had no name for, like a limb that had fallen asleep and would not wake, except that the limb was the most essential part of him. He found himself, in the dark hours before dawn when sleep refused to come, doing something that embarrassed him in the daylight, replaying the night at Graymere, the windswept battlements, the borrowed furs, the woman who had talked to him for 4 hours about everything except politics, which had been so extraordinary and so rare that he had not understood how precious it was until it was gone. He had been careless with it. He had been careless with her. He had told himself, after Graymere, that the meeting had been pleasant, but that the duty of the blood moon ceremony was fixed, and that his wolf would confirm what he had already decided. He had believed that. He had believed it right up until the moment he stood in the fire circle, and his wolf had recoiled so violently from the woman beside him that he'd barely managed to contain the reaction. He had never connected those two things clearly in the immediate aftermath, because the night at Graymere had been private, and the ceremony had been public, and his mind had been full of the sight of Marin Voss walking back through the crowd with her chin high and her hands shaking, and her white-flowered braids undone by the wind. But now, 2 years later in the dark, with his wolf howling low and constant in his chest like a warning bell he had no way to answer, he was beginning to connect them. He had asked Kedron, his commander, a sharp, quiet man of 40 with a soldier's economy of movement and a deep loyalty that went beyond duty, to look into the matter of Lady Marin Voss. Not officially. Quietly. He had asked him to find out where she was, whether she was well. Kedron had returned 3 weeks later with a very short report delivered in the tone of a man who had found something he wasn't sure how to present. "She is at Thornfield, Your Grace, the family estate." "Is she well?" "She appears to be. She manages the estate herself. The tenants speak well of her." A pause. "She is not alone," Kedron had added very carefully. Kedrick had looked at him. "What do you mean?" "She has a child, Your Grace, a son." The words landed in the silence of the study, with the weight of something dropped from a great height. Kedrick had not moved for a long time. "How old?" His voice had come out unrecognizable to himself, scraped and quiet. "Approximately 2 years, Your Grace, perhaps just under." Kedrick had stared at the map on the wall in front of him, the detailed parchment map of the 5 northern territories that he had been starring at his entire life, and he had done the calculation that, once done, could not be undone. "Leave me," he had said. Kedron had left. And for the first time in 2 years, the wolf in Kedrick's chest had stopped making its constant grinding sound of muted anguish. It had gone very quiet. And then it had made a sound he had never heard it make before, low and focused and certain, the sound of a wolf that has finally understood the shape of what it has been missing. "Kedron," Kedrick said, 2 days later, with the settled calm of a man who has reached the bottom of something and found solid ground. "Ready my horse and a small company. 12 men, no banners. We ride at first light." "Destination, Your Grace." "Thornfield." Marin was in the barn when she heard the horses. She heard them with the ears of someone who had spent 2 years listening for exactly this sound, the particular rhythm of many hooves moving together in organized formation, the sound of trained military horses rather than the loose, varied clopping of merchant carts or the single set of hooves belonging to a neighbor. She set down the bag of oats she had been carrying and stood very still. Through the gap in the barn's upper boards, she could see the road below the valley. 12 riders, dark cloaks, no visible insignia, but the bearing of soldiers was unmistakable in the way they sat and moved. And at the front, tall, broad-shouldered, the dark gold hair visible even from a distance, someone who did not ride like a soldier because he rode like a king. No. Her first thought was purely physical, a rush of cold through her chest, down her arms to her fingertips. Her second thought was Ray's. She was out of the barn before she had consciously decided to move. Ray's was in the courtyard. He was sitting in a patch of weak spring sunlight with a collection of smooth river stones he had been arranging and rearranging for the past hour with great seriousness. He looked up when she came through the barn door quickly, reading her face the way he always did, with an unnerving directness, those pale ice eyes tracking her expression like a compass finding north. "Mohammed." "Inside," she said quietly, her voice steady through sheer force of will. "Go find Grandmother Etta. Stay in the kitchen." "Why?" "Because I asked you, quick love." He gathered his stones with the focused efficiency that was so characteristic of him, not scattering them in his hurry, but collecting them deliberately, as though leaving them disordered would be a mistake. Then he ran for the house. Marin stood in the center of the courtyard and forced herself to breathe. She had planned for this. She had made plans. She knew what she was going to say. She had rehearsed it in the dark, alone, many times, the way you rehearse something you dread because the rehearsal is the only control you have over it. The horses came through the estate gate. The riders behind fell back, pulling to the sides of the approach road with the professional ease of men who knew when to make themselves background. The lead rider slowed to a walk, then a stop, and dismounted. He was bigger than she remembered, or perhaps she had been small in her memory of him. He handed his reins to one of his men without looking and walked toward her across the frostbitten courtyard, with the deliberate, measured pace of someone who had decided to be careful. He stopped 10 feet away. They looked at each other. Kedrick looked different. There were shadows under his ice-pale eyes that she didn't remember, and the hard angles of his face had sharpened in ways that spoke less of fitness, and more of something having been worn down over time. He wore no armor, just a heavy riding coat in dark gray, simple and functional. Without the crown and the ceremony and the firelight, he looked remarkably like the man who had stood on a windswept battlements in borrowed furs and talked to her about his father's hounds. It was, she thought, a cruelly effective observation. "Marin," he said. His voice was the same, low, careful, the voice of a man measuring every word against potential consequence. "Your Grace," she replied, deliberately formal, deliberately a distance. A pause, a brief particular muscle moved in his jaw. "You didn't tell me," he said. It wasn't accusatory. It was almost wondering, as though he was still working out the shape of the fact. 2 years. You were carrying my child when you left Ashenvale and you didn't tell me." "No," she said, "I didn't." "Why?" And here was the moment she had rehearsed. The prepared answer was clean and reasonable, because I didn't want him used as a political instrument, because I didn't trust what you would do with the information, because you had already made your choice clear. All of it true, all of it defensible. But she looked at him, at the exhaustion in his face and the careful way he was holding himself, like a man trying not to startle something that might flee. And the prepared answer felt like a shield that was also a wall, and she was suddenly very tired of walls. "Because you called my mother's name in front of 200 people," she said, her voice very quiet and very even. "And I decided on that road in the dark that this child would belong to me first, before the crown, before the wolf, before anyone's plans or anyone's politics or anyone's ceremony. Mine." Kedrick was quiet for a moment. His ice-pale eyes moved past her toward the house. "I want to see him," he said. "I know," she said, "but I want to tell you something first, and I need you to actually hear it." He looked back at her, he nodded. "You do not get to walk in here with your 12 men and your crown somewhere in your saddlebag," Marin said, "and pick up a story that you paused 2 years ago and start it from where you left off. That is not how this works. He doesn't know you. He doesn't know what a king is. He is 2 years old and he is mine, and if you want anything from me, any truth, any access, any beginning of trust, you will stand in this courtyard for as long as it takes, and you will let me decide the terms." A long silence. "Yes," Kedrick said. He said it without qualification, without the slight hesitation of a man who was agreeing while privately calculating how to renegotiate later. He said it the way he had said things on the battlements at Graymere, when there had been no court to perform for. Marin studied him for another moment. Then she turned and walked to the house. The kitchen was warm and smelled of wood smoke, and the rosemary edda grew in pots on the windowsill. Rays was sitting at the table. He had his stones arranged in a row in front of him by color, but his attention was fixed on the kitchen door with an intensity that suggested he had been listening since the riders arrived. Edda stood at the hearth with her arms folded. She looked at Marin, then toward the window that faced the courtyard and said nothing. "There is someone here who would like to meet you," Marin said to Rays, keeping her voice measured and calm. Rays looked at her. "The big man," he said. "Yes." "His wolf is loud," Rays said, with the matter-of-fact certainty of a child reporting something entirely obvious. "I could hear it from outside." Marin's breath caught very slightly. "Could you?" "It sounds like it's been looking for something." He picked up a pale gray stone from his row and turned it over in his fingers, like it found it. Edda made a soft sound by the fire that might have been a suppressed remark of some kind. Marin crossed to her son, knelt down to his level and looked at his face, his father's eyes in her son's face, still managing to surprise her every single day. "Are you frightened?" Rays considered this with the seriousness he brought to all things. "No," he decided. "Are you?" She thought about answering him honestly. She decided he deserved it. "A little," she said, "but I know how to be brave when I'm a little frightened. You've seen me do it." He nodded, satisfied. "Can I bring my stones?" "Yes." He collected them. They went to the door together. Kedrick was still standing in the courtyard, alone. He had sent his men to wait at the gate, and he stood in the cold spring light with his hands loose at his sides, in the patient stillness of a man who has decided to be exactly as still as the situation requires. He saw the door open, he saw Manor step out, and then he saw the boy. He had known, intellectually, since Kedron's report. He had calculated. He had prepared himself. He had told himself that 2 years was enough time to build emotional readiness for a meeting of this significance. He had been entirely wrong about that. Ray stepped out of the doorway behind his mother, a small collection of smooth river stones held in one careful hand, and looked across the courtyard at his father with ice-pale eyes that were the precise shade and clarity of a winter sky. Kedrick's wolf did not howl. It did not lunge or press or demand. It simply went still in a way it had not been still in 2 years, and in that stillness was something he recognized finally for what it was, recognition. The wolf had known the child before the man did. It had been reaching toward Thornfield for 2 years, unable to name what it was reaching for, only knowing the direction. He crossed the courtyard. He stopped a respectful distance from the boy and crouched down, reducing himself, deliberately making himself smaller, the way he had seen Manor do, so that the child was not looking up at him. Rays looked at him directly without flinching, without the usual shyness of children faced with large strangers. He held out one of his stones, a pale gray one, smooth and round. "This one is the color of your eyes," Rays said. "I found it in the river." Kedrick took the stone from his son's hand. He turned it over in his fingers. His jaw tightened with something that was not anger. "It's a good stone," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "I know," Rays agreed with serene confidence. The ghost of something, not quite a smile, but the shape where one might have lived, moved across Kedrick's face. He looked up at Manor, who was watching from the cottage doorway with her arms crossed and her expression somewhere between guarded and something else she wasn't letting surface. Their eyes met. Neither of them looked away. "I made a mistake at Graymere," Kedrick said, his voice low and direct. "I was careless with something that deserved care. I knew it by the time I reached Ashenvale, and I made no effort to correct it because I had convinced myself that the wolf's choice at the ceremony would settle everything. I was wrong." "And the blood moon ceremony," Manor said flatly, "calling my mother's name. My wolf was lying to me," he said. "Or I was lying to my wolf. I don't fully understand it yet. What I know is that the bond with your mother has not completed in 2 years because the wolf refuses to seal something it knows is false. She has been living in your queen's tower for 2 years, Kedrick." The use of his name, not his title, shifted something in the air between them. "I know," he said. "That is an injustice I am responsible for, to her and to you." The silence that followed was a working silence, not comfortable but not hostile, the kind of silence that has possibility in it if neither person destroys it. Rays tugged at his mother's hand. "Mama, can the big man have dinner?" Edda's voice floated from somewhere inside. "I've already put on more stew." Manor looked at Kedrick for a long moment. Something in her expression shifted, very slightly, in the direction of reluctant amusement. "Apparently you're staying for dinner," she said. "Apparently," Kedrick agreed. Dinner was, in its own strange way, one of the most disarming evenings of Kedrick's adult life. The kitchen was small and the table was plain wood, and the stew was thick with root vegetables, and the bread was the good heavy kind that came from a house where people actually ate. Edda sat at one end of the table and watched everyone with the bright, relentless eyes of a woman who had seen many things and was updating her assessment in real time. Ray sat beside his mother and made his stones into a line along the table's edge and talked, with complete uninhibited confidence, about the river, the household dogs, the cat he had been chasing, and his firm belief that the gray mare in the paddock was smarter than most people. Kedrick listened. He asked questions. He did not perform warmth. He had never been good at performing it, but something about the way he asked about the horse with genuine curiosity made Reyes look at him with renewed attention and say, "Do you know about horses?" "I know a fair amount about horses." "Papa had horses," Reyes said, referring to Edric Voss, whom he had never met but clearly knew something about. "Mama says he had the best horses in Thornfield." "Your grandfather was known for his horses," Kedrick said carefully. "I want a horse," Reyes stated. "Mama says when I'm 5. "That seems reasonable." "I could be ready before 5. "You might be." Reyes considered him with those clear, precise eyes. "Do you have horses at your house?" A brief pause. "Many." "How many is many?" "More than I've counted." This seemed to impress Reyes enormously. He turned to his mother. "Mama, he has more horses than he can count." "I heard," Marin said. She was watching Kedrick across the table with an expression she was doing her best to control. He saw it anyway. Saw the way the careful guardedness was in active, complicated conversation with something softer. The look of a woman who was watching a man be kind to her son, and finding it unexpectedly difficult to be as unmoved as she intended. He filed that observation away, carefully. After dinner, when Reyes had been carried to bed by Marin, and Etta had retired to her room with a look over her shoulder that communicated more in a glance than most people managed in a conversation, Kedrick sat alone at the kitchen table and looked at the last of the fire. When Marin came back, she paused in the doorway. Then she came in and sat across from him, wrapping her hands around a cup of cold tea. They sat like that for a moment, two people at a kitchen table at the end of a strange day. "What do you want from this?" she asked. "From coming here, what do you actually want?" He thought about the careful answer, the political answer, the measured, diplomatic answer that outlined the practical requirements of succession and bloodline and alliance. "I want the chance to be his father," he said. "Not a title, not an arrangement, his father." A pause. "And you," he said. "What do you want, Marin? Not what you'll accept, not what you'll tolerate. What do you want?" She looked at the fire for a long time. "I want a matter," she said quietly. "Not because of my name or my house or what I can provide. I want a matter to someone because of who I actually am." She didn't look at him as she said it. If she had, she would have seen what it did to his face. Kedrick stayed at Thornfield for 4 days. He did not ask for anything more than had been offered. He slept in the small guest room with its low ceiling and its single window overlooking the paddock. He helped, without being asked, with the firewood on the second morning, which was how Marin found him when she came downstairs at dawn, in a simple work coat, stacking split logs against the barn wall with efficient, quiet competence, while Reyes, who had apparently heard him from his room, sat on the fence and supervised. It did something to her, seeing that. She pressed her lips together and went back inside to make tea and told herself it was not significant. It was entirely significant. By the 4th morning, something between them had shifted in the way things shift when the formal structures are removed, and what's left is just two people moving through the practical business of an ordinary day together. Not resolved, not simple, but different from what it had been. On the 4th evening, Kedrick found Marin in the barn, checking the gray mare's near foreleg for a stone bruise she had noticed earlier. "I have to go back," he said. "The council cannot manage more than a week without a meeting I'm physically present for." "I know," she said, not looking up from the horse's leg. "You always had to go back. That's what kings do." He came and stood beside the mare, running a hand along her neck in the way of someone who genuinely knew horses. The mare, who was indeed very intelligent and a good judge of character, did not shy. "Come to Ashenvale," he said. "Not as a prisoner, not as anything with a title attached. Bring Etta, bring Reyes. Come and let me give you a house in the city, proper security, proper resources. Let me." "Let you do what?" She finally looked up. "Let you put us in a tower where you can keep us safe and accessible and quietly sorted, while you figure out what to do about my mother and the bonding ceremony you haven't completed." No, his voice was flat and direct. Let me fix what I broke, openly and correctly before the whole court. She held his gaze. You would publicly set aside my mother as Luna designate and acknowledge a child born outside of the bonding. Yes. That will fracture your counsel. The lords who have been managing around your mother's presence for 2 years will see it as weakness. Some of them. It could invite challenges from the eastern territories, from the border clans. I know what it costs, he said steadily. I know exactly what it costs. I have been calculating it for 4 days. I'm asking you anyway. Manor looked at him for a long time. The flame of the barn lantern between them cast warm light on both their faces, and for a moment she let herself see him clearly, not as the Alpha King, not as the man who had caused her enormous pain, but as the specific, complicated, genuinely trying person standing in her barn talking to her in the direct way that had once made her stand on a cold battlement for 4 hours without noticing the time. I will think about it, she said. It was not a yes, but it was also not the no she had prepared. He nodded, accepting that completely. That's enough. He left the next morning with his 12 men, and the valley returned to its ordinary quiet. But the quiet felt different now, inhabited by something that hadn't been there before, an absence that was the particular shape of a specific person. Manor noticed it, and found it annoying, and found finding it annoying in turn, and went about her day with more than usual energy. She was in the east field, mending a section of fence, when Reyes appeared beside her and held out his stone collection for her to admire the new arrangement. She paused to look at it seriously. Mama, he said, is the big man coming back? I don't know yet. Reyes turned the pale gray stone over in his fingers, the one he'd given Kedrick, and that Kedrick had quietly returned when he left, setting it on the kitchen windowsill where it caught the morning light. He left his stone, Reyes said, but he'll want it back. Will he? Yes, Reyes said, with the serene certainty that was his default mode. So he has to come back. Manor looked at her son. You worked that out yourself. It's obvious, Mama. She huffed. Then she picked up her fence mallet and went back to work. But she was smiling. Manor made her decision on a gray morning 6 weeks after Kedrick's visit, when a sealed letter arrived from Ashenvale bearing the Dunmore crest, and inside, 2 pages in a hand she recognized, Kedrick's own, not a secretary's, and none of the formal diplomatic language she had braced for. He had written to her the way he talked on battlements. He told her what was happening at Ashenvale. The council fractures, the Eastern Lord's restlessness, the bonding ceremony that remained incomplete. He told her, with a directness that must have cost him something, that his wolf had been more settled in 4 days at Thornfield than in 2 years behind the walls of the keep. He told her he understood that trust was not a thing that could be declared or demanded, and that he intended to demonstrate rather than claim. At the end of the letter, in a slightly different ink as though it had been added after he thought the letter was finished, he had written, Reyes gave me a stone. I have been carrying it. I'm not certain he knows what that means, but I think the wolf does. Manor read that last paragraph 3 times. Then she folded the letter, put it in the cedar box where she kept the few things that mattered, and went to find Etta. We're going to Ashenvale, she said. Etta looked up from her knitting. When? As soon as I can arrange it. I'll start packing, Etta said without a trace of surprise. The journey to Ashenvale took 6 days. Kedrick had sent a proper escort, not 12 men this time, but 30, with a coach and outriders and a letter of safe passage that bore the royal seal. Manor had almost refused the coach on principle, but Reyes had taken one look at it and made a sound of such absolute delight that the principle had been quietly shelved. The city of Ashenvale spread across the base of its mountain like a deep-rooted thing that had grown there rather than been built. It was larger and louder and more overwhelming than anything Reyes had encountered, and he spent the entire entry through the city gates with his face pressed to the coach window, his pale eyes taking in everything with an intensity that drew the eyes of the people they passed. It drew eyes for other reasons too. Marin noticed them, the looks, people who glanced at the approaching coach and then looked more carefully at the small face in the window, a blacksmith who set down his hammer, a woman selling bread who went still, children who stopped chasing each other and stared. She felt the recognition, moving through the crowd like a current. He has his father's face, she thought. There is no hiding that. And then as they crossed into the inner courtyard of Ashenvale Keep, she thought, good, let them see it, let it be plain. Kedrick was waiting in the inner courtyard. He did not wait inside the throne room, surrounded by his court in a formal display of power. He waited in the courtyard, alone in his riding coat, the way he had waited in the courtyard at Thornfield. She noticed that deliberate parallel and felt the complicated warmth of being genuinely understood by someone you're still deciding whether to trust. Ray scrambled out of the coach before it had fully stopped, startling the footman, and ran directly across the cobblestones to his father with the absolute confidence of a child who has decided what the situation requires. Kedrick caught him. He swung the boy up with both hands, and Rays grabbed his shoulders and looked at him with those clear ice-pale eyes from a height of about 6 feet, apparently very satisfied with the view. You kept the stone, Rays said accusingly. I did, Kedrick confirmed. I told Mama you'd have to come back for it. You were right. I know. Marin stepped down from the coach and watched them. The sight of her son held in his father's arms, easy and untroubled, with the towers of Ashenvale rising behind them and the mountain sky enormous above. It landed somewhere deep in her chest in a way that mixed grief and hope in a combination she had no category for. Kedrick looked at her over Rays's shoulder. His ice-pale eyes were very direct. Welcome to Ashenvale, he said. I meant what I wrote. I know, she said. That's why I came. What happened over the following weeks was not a fairy tale. It was an unfolding that had the texture of real things, uneven, sometimes awkward, full of moments where old wounds pressed against new intentions, and the whole enterprise seemed about to stall. There were difficult conversations in cold corridors and dinners, where the court's watching eyes were a constant, uncomfortable pressure. There were moments when Marin sat alone in the rooms Kedrick had given her, and felt the familiar cold clench of vulnerability, and wondered whether she had made a terrible mistake. And there was, unavoidably, her mother. The meeting between Marin and Silvara happened on the 6th morning after her arrival in Ashenvale, in the Queen's Tower where Silvara had lived for 2 years, surrounded by the trappings of a position she had never quite fully occupied. The tower room was beautiful, in the cold, precise way of rooms that have been decorated to impress rather than comfort. Silvara sat in a high-backed chair by the window, wearing deep blue silk, her dark and silver hair immaculate. She looked, as always, composed. But she was thinner than Marin remembered. The sharp elegance of her face had sharpened further, in ways that spoke less of strength and more of something being maintained at considerable cost. Marin sat across from her, no servants, no one else. For a moment, neither of them spoke. You came, Silvara said finally. He asked me to, Marin said, and I chose to. I heard about the boy. Silvara's voice was carefully neutral. What he looks like, what he is. His name is Rays. Something moved across Silvara's composed face, brief and unguarded, the first purely unguarded thing Marin could remember seeing there. Rays, she repeated softly. Your grandfather's name. Yes. Silence. You should have told me, Silvara said, at Thornfield when I asked. You didn't ask, Marin said. You looked. There is a difference. Silvara was quiet for a moment. You're right, she said, for the second time in Marin's experience. It landed differently this time, heavier, less like a concession and more like the beginning of something. What happens now, Marin asked, to you? The king has asked me to release him from the designation, Silvara said. Her voice was even. "He has been very honorable about it. He will ensure House Voss maintains its standing. I will return to Thornfield if you will have me, or to the holding at Meyerfest if you prefer distance." Marin looked at her mother. At the composed face and the elegant gown and the careful hands, and the thinness that had come from 2 years of maintaining a position, that her daughter's child had just undone with a set of smooth river stones, and a pair of pale gray eyes. "You are not happy here," Marin said. "It wasn't a question." Silvara was quiet for a long moment. "No," she said finally, very softly, "I was not." "Did you love him?" "I respected him. I believed I could serve him well." A pause. "That is not the same thing. I understood that eventually." Marin leaned forward slightly. "Did you love father?" The question clearly surprised Silvara. Something shifted in her silver-dark eyes, old and complicated and entirely real. "Very much," she said. "From the beginning to the end. I have never loved anyone the way I loved your father." The information settled into Marin like something coming finally into focus. She understood with that clarity, something she had not understood before, that her mother's reaching for the crown had not been the hunger of an ambitious woman replacing a loved daughter. It had been the reaching of a grief-hollowed woman for something that felt like solidity after loss, wrong-headed and harmful in its execution, not malicious at its root. The understanding did not fix everything, but it changed the texture of the anger, softened its sharpest edges. "Come to Thornfield," Marin said. "Not right away. In the spring when the passes are easy. Come and meet Reyes properly. Let him know his grandmother." Silvara looked at her. The composed face cracked just once, just for a moment, the way a frozen river cracks when the thaw finally comes. "You would allow that?" "He deserves the family he has," Marin said. "All of it, even the complicated parts." The formal hearing of the court happened 3 days later. Kedrick had called every lord and lady in residence, every senior council member, every ranking warrior of the guard. The great hall of Ashenvale was full in a way that it had rarely been, the candles burning bright in their hundreds, the stone floor echoing with the boots of the assembled court. Marin stood to the right of the dais in a gown Kedrick had not ordered but merely made available, deep forest green, the color of her first ceremonial gown, and she wondered if he had remembered or if it was coincidence, and had decided either answer told her something worth knowing. Reyes stood beside her, very clean and very serious in a small tunic of Dunmore black, holding his stone collection in both hands. Kedrick stood on the dais. He wore his full armor and the obsidian crown. He looked exactly like a king. He spoke without notes and without the careful diplomatic phrasing that courts expected, and that meant very little. He told them the truth. He told them about the night at Graymere. He told them about the blood moon ceremony and his wolf's refusal. He told them about 2 years of an incomplete bonding and the growing conviction, built over months of his wolf's anguished restlessness, that he had been mistaken. He acknowledged, plainly and publicly, that the Lady Silvara Voss had been placed in an impossible position through no fault of her own character, and that House Voss would be honored and protected. He announced the formal dissolution of the Luna-designate arrangement, accepted by Silvara herself the previous day in a private ceremony of great dignity. Then he said, "The true heir of the Dunmore line stands in this hall. His name is Reyes. He is 2 years old. He is the son of Lady Marin Voss, and he is mine." The hall did not explode in noise. It went the particular quality of very still that happens when a large group of people hear something they suspected, and are now being asked to reckon with as established fact. A lord from the Eastern Holdings, a thick-necked man named Derek Ashford, one of the council's more combative members, stepped forward. "Your Grace, the law of the binding requires." "The law of the binding requires the blood right between an alpha king and his true mate," Kedrick said, cutting across him with the quiet authority of a man who has prepared for this specific objection. Not an arranged candidate, not a designated Luna, his true mate. He looked at Marin. not with the performance of a king making a political point, with the directness of a specific man looking at a specific woman in a room full of people, not caring what the room made of it. "I am claiming my true mate," he said. "Before this court, before the old law, the wolf and the man are agreed." Then something happened that none of the assembled court expected. King Kedrick Dunmore stepped down from the dais and walked the length of the hall to where Marin and Rays were standing. He stopped in front of them. He looked at Marin for a moment, and she looked back, and there was an entire conversation in that look, layered and honest, and full of the specific weight of everything that had happened. Then he went down on one knee. Not the formal, ceremonial knee of a king performing a required gesture. He went down on both knees, on the cold stone floor, in his full armor, before a woman in a forest green gown and a 2-year-old boy with a fistful of river stones. "I don't ask for your forgiveness," he said. His voice was quiet enough that only the nearest few people could hear him, but the hall had gone so still that it carried anyway. "That is not something that can be asked for or given on a schedule. I ask only for the chance to deserve it, over time, in the doing of things rather than the saying of them." Rays, for his part, looked at his father on his knees and with great seriousness placed the pale gray stone, the eye-colored one, into Kedrick's upraised palm. "You can have it back now," Rays said. "You don't have to come back for it because you're already here." The silence in the hall had a different quality now. Kedrick closed his fingers around the stone. He looked at Marin. She held his gaze for a long, honest moment. Then she offered him her hand, not a queen's formal gesture, but the simple hand of a woman choosing to take a step. He took it. He stood. The blood moon ceremony, when it finally happened, truly happened, with no blood-soaked bouquet and no Darkheart's interference, and no one standing in a circle they weren't certain about, took place on a warm evening at the turn of the season, when the snow on the mountain peaks had begun to soften, and the courtyard fires felt welcoming rather than necessary. The assembled court was there. Father Rays, old and fragile but present and clearly delighted by the alignment of his name with the child watching from beside the ceremonial circle. Etta, standing near the front with her arms folded and her eyes bright. Kedrin, the commander, wearing the expression of a man who has navigated a long and complicated campaign and has arrived at something he would not quite call relief, but is adjacent to it. And Silvara Voss, standing at the edge of the crowd in a plain gray gown with her hands folded and her silver-dark hair loose, watching her daughter walk into the fire circle with her chin up and her shoulders straight, and her dark hair unbraided and uncroated by flowers. Just herself, exactly herself, and for the first time in her adult life not trying to be anything other than that. The courtyard held its breath. Every person present, lords in their ceremonial furs, guards at measured attention, servants pressed to the walls, felt the change in the air when Marin stepped into the fire circle. It was not a visible thing. It was a pressure, the way the air changes before lightning finds the ground. A deep, thrumming certainty that ran through the stone underfoot and the wood of the great doors and the bones of everyone standing near the fire. Father Rays raised his carved bone staff. His aged, thin voice rang clear in the fire-lit silence. The old law calls. The alpha speaks. The wolf and the mate stand witness to each other. Let the bond be made in blood and fire and the full sight of this court. Kedrick turned to Marin. He held out his hand. She looked at it, at the rough, capable hand of a man who had, she now knew, spent the morning stacking firewood in her barn, and the last 2 months writing honest letters and building, patiently and without visible reward, a foundation worth standing on. She placed her hand in his. The wolf in Kedrick's chest did not hesitate. From the moment Marin stepped into the circle, it was the particular stillness of an animal that has come home, not the frantic, searching quiet of the past 2 years, but the deep, settled quiet of something that has finally put down a weight it has been carrying too long. The blood rite was performed, the bond sealed, and Kedrick, who had never in his adult life shifted his wolf in front of a full court, who had maintained the king's careful human composure through every ceremony and every crisis, let the shift come. It came like a wave that had been held back too long. The massive silver wolf of the Dunmore line emerged in the firelight, enormous and luminous, and it did not howl or posture or display the aggression of territory claimed. It simply turned to the woman standing in the circle, lowered its great head, and pressed its nose gently to the palm of her hand. The court watched in absolute silence. Manor laid her hand on the wolf's broad silver head and looked into the ice-pale eyes that were her son's eyes and her husband's eyes, and the eyes of the wolf that had been reaching for her since Graymere, and she felt the bond settle into her chest like a warm hand pressed over an old wound, not erasing it, not pretending it hadn't existed, but holding it steady. "Hello," she said quietly, to the wolf and the man both. The wolf made a sound low in its chest, warm and certain. From just outside the circle, a small, clear voice said, with absolute conviction, "I knew it." Ray's, standing beside Etta, clutching his stone collection, watching his father's wolf and his mother standing in the light of the bonfire, with the kind of satisfaction that only 2-year-olds and very old women ever permit themselves to feel openly. Etta looked down at him. "You did, didn't you?" she said. "Yes," he said. "The wolf told me, the very first day." The secret that could have brought down a kingdom did not bring it down. It built it instead. Not in the way of clean stories, not without difficulty or time or the long, unglamorous work of two people learning to trust each other through the doing of ordinary days, not without the fractious council and the challenging Eastern lords and the occasional resurgence of old gossip, not without the quiet, complicated work of a daughter and her mother finding their way towards something that was not forgiveness exactly, and not distance exactly, but something honest in between. But Ray's grew, fast and certain, with his father's eyes and his mother's stubbornness, and a quality that was entirely his own, a deep, attentive stillness, the stillness of someone who listens to wolves, who hears the things that aren't being said, who holds small gray stones up to the light as though they contain information worth knowing. When he was 5, he was given his horse. His father taught him to ride on a calm gray gelding in the inner courtyard of Ashenvale, and his mother watched from the courtyard wall and did not tell them she was watching until after. When he was 6, his wolf spoke to him for the first time in full, not growling, not the instinctive half-sounds of his infancy, but clearly the way his father's wolf had always spoken, and he walked into the kitchen where Manor was making tea and told her about it with great seriousness, as though reporting something that required her immediate attention. She set down the teapot and listened to every word. When she told Kedrick that evening, sitting by the fire in the room that had become theirs, genuinely theirs, in the inhabited way of rooms that have been lived in rather than occupied, she watched the expression on his face cycle through wonder and tenderness, and a fierce, private pride that he would never have displayed for anyone else. "He'll be strong," Kedrick said, "stronger than I was at that age." "Stronger than you are now, probably," Manor said. Kedrick considered this. "Probably," he agreed without injury. She leaned against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The fire crackled. "You know what the strangest part is," she said quietly. "What?" He already knew. He told me that first day, that your wolf had been crying, that it sounded like it was looking for something. Kedrick was quiet for a moment. He was right. "He usually is," she said. "It's insufferable." He laughed, really laughed, the laugh that was rare and completely real, the one she had first heard on a cold battlement in borrowed furs, and she felt it in her chest like the last of a long winter finally letting go. Outside the high windows of Ashenvale Keep, the mountain stood permanent and patient against the night sky, the first stars coming out above the peaks, the bonfire of a lesser celebration somewhere in the outer courtyard casting warm light against the ancient stone. The wolf in Kedrick's chest was quiet. Not hollow quiet, not the starving silence of the years. Full quiet. The quiet of an animal that has found what it was looking for and has no further need to search. Marin felt it through the bond, warm and certain like a hand pressed over an old wound, not erasing it, holding it steady. She closed her eyes. This, she thought, this is what the stone was waiting for. Outside, somewhere in the corridor, the padding sound of small, purposeful feet indicated that Rays had decided that whatever was happening in this room was more interesting than sleeping. A soft knock, 3 raps, exactly like his grandmother's. "Mama, Papa, the wolf told me something." Marin and Kedrick looked at each other. The expression on his face was worth every single one of the 2 years in the cold. "Come in, Rays," Marin called. The door opened. Their son came in, pale-eyed and serious and carrying, as always, his stones. The fire crackled. The mountains held their silence outside. And the house of Dunmore, built slowly and honestly out of something that had nearly been entirely lost, was warm. If Marin's strength moved you, if Rays' stones made you smile, if the wolf coming home felt earned, please like, share, and subscribe so you never miss the next story. Tell me in the comments, which moment hit you hardest? The courtyard at Thornfield, the stone in the fire circle, or the knock at the door at the end? The best stories are the ones we finish together. See you at the next one. 3 years after the blood moon ceremony that finally sealed the bond, Ashenvale was different. Not in the large, proclamation-worthy ways. The banners were still black and silver. The mountain still loomed. The council was still full of men who considered their own opinions more valuable than the evidence generally warranted. The large things changed slowly and required constant tending, like the estate roof or the downstream water rights, and Marin had made a particular peace with that. It was different in the small ways. There was a child's wooden horse in the corner of the study, where Rays had left it during a visit and no one had moved it, partly because Kedrick kept glancing at it with an expression he didn't notice he was wearing. There were fresh flowers in the window embrasures, Marin's insistence, and effective, and the kitchens had been reorganized for actual use rather than ceremonial display. The cook had expressed mild outrage and come around within a fortnight. Kedrin, the commander, had developed the habit of making his morning reports 3 minutes earlier than required, because there was usually fresh bread in the corridor outside the study at that hour. He told himself it was about efficiency. No one corrected him. Etta had her own room in the keep, a small one on the south wall, warm and full of her plants and her knitting and her particular quality of observant silence. She said little and noticed everything. The court had developed a collective, unspoken understanding that old Etta was not someone you were casual around, and this understanding was entirely correct. Silvara had come in the spring, as Marin had offered. She had stood in the Thornfield courtyard and met her grandson for the first time, Rays, who had sized her up with his pale, precise eyes for a long moment, and then held out a stone for her inspection. She had taken it very seriously, turning it over in her fingers, asking about where he had found it, and in that exchange something had quietly and without ceremony begun. She visited twice a year now. She and Marin were not the mother and daughter they might have been in a different story. They were something more accurate, 2 women finding their way toward a real understanding of each other, without the pretense that the past had not happened. It was slower. It was more honest. Marin found she preferred honesty to pretense, even when pretense would have been easier. On a clear autumn morning, Marin stood at the outer wall of Ashenvale and looked at the mountains. The peaks had their first early snow, the high, crisp kind that meant the deep winter was still weeks away, which was a comfortable thought. Behind her, somewhere in the courtyard below, she could hear Rays and his father. The sound of Kedrick's voice, patient and low, coaching his son through something. The sound of Rays' voice, certain and focused, asking exactly the questions a child asks when he is genuinely interested rather than performing interest. She listened to them for a while without turning around. When Kedrick came to stand beside her at the wall, she could tell from the sound of his footstep which mood he was in, not anxious, not burdened, but the particular quiet ease of a man who has been doing something he likes with someone he loves. "He shifted today," Kedrick said. Marin turned to look at him, properly. For about 20 seconds, a pause. Then he was very annoyed that he couldn't hold it longer and wanted to try immediately again. "That sounds exactly like him." "The wolf is silver," Kedrick said. "Like mine, but his eyes when he shifts." "Dark," Marin said, "like mine." "Yes." He looked at her with the quiet directness that she had come to understand was not a performance of openness but its genuine article. "Like yours." She looked back at the mountains. The morning light was good, the particular clear gold of autumn that makes everything look more solid and present than usual, each stone on the wall distinct and real. "Are you happy?" Kedrick asked. It was not from him, a small question. She gave it the weight it deserved. "Yes," she said, "not in the way I thought it would look, but yes." He nodded. He did not press it or expand it or turn it into more than it was. It was a thing she had come to appreciate about him, his capacity to accept a complete answer and let it be complete. Below them in the courtyard, Reyes let out a sound of fierce concentration, the audible exhale of a child giving something everything. And the morning was briefly, gloriously interrupted by the appearance of a small silver wolf, no bigger than a large dog, blinking in the autumn light with wide dark eyes that were entirely his mother's. The wolf lasted 11 seconds this time. Then Reyes was Reyes again, sitting on the cobblestones looking slightly dazed and very pleased with himself. He looked up and found his parents at the wall, watching. "Longer," he announced. "Much longer," Marin called back. He got up, dusted his hands on his breeches, and with characteristic focus began preparing to try again. Kedrick's hand found Marin's at the wall. She turned her palm up to meet it. The mountains held their ancient silence. The bond between them ran warm and steady, the way a river runs under ice in deep winter, beneath the surface, constant, carrying everything. The wolf and the woman and the king and their son, none of them exactly what the old stories said they should be. All of them entirely, honestly, precisely what they were. The autumn light held. The small silver wolf shook itself, set its paws and prepared to try again.